Okay, well, we're recording. So, first of all, Alex, thank you for joining me for an episode of the Dead Parent Club podcast. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and sit with me and tell me about your parents.
I'm so excited to join in. Thanks for having me.
No problem. If you don't mind, we can just start with you introducing yourself to our listeners, to who you are, where you're from, and then we'll just kind of dive into your own story.
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Alex. I run the Grief Kitchen. I'm really interested in the relationships between food and grief. I'm based in the Cotswolds and I am usually a chef, but obviously due to COVID, that's brought me online to try and start this kind of food-based grief community.
Cotswolds is so beautiful. You must feel really lucky to be there. You've been there your whole life.
I lived in London for a few years after university, but I just moved back here last year after COVID struck, and it was the best timing because
I bet.
so lucky to kind of go on these lovely long walks in the countryside, and when it snows, there's actually like actual snow. It's really nice.
Oh, what a
I'm
dream.
really enjoying it. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Well, obviously you're part of the Dead Parent Club, unfortunately, the club that none of us want to be a part of, but we are.
Yeah.
Prematurely, of course. So could you please give our listeners an insight into who you lost and as much detail as you want into the circumstances behind that as well?
Yeah, of course. So to give you an idea, I'm 31. I lost my dad when I was 18. He was in a road accident. He was only 48 at the time, which as I get older now, I realise how young that really was. And well, that was obviously an accident. That's one type of grief. And then my parents were very happily married, died 7 years later. She had cancer for 3 years. I've always felt, well, from the moment I found out about her diagnosis, I just said, this is dad. This is because of dad. I think there's such a
stress.
Yeah, I think there's a real link between your mental health and your physical health. I really believe that grief and that depth of sorrow really made her unwell. It's actually quite strange just to talk about this so kind of comfortably because I feel I'm worried. But obviously this is the kind of perfect place to talk about it. But yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a nice thing about being on this podcast is that, like I was saying to somebody the other day, how often do you actually get to speak honestly without kind of dumbing down your experience? Do you know when you say to people, oh, but it's fine, it was a while ago now, or you know, you kind of right now, like you're in an opportunity where you can be completely like brutally honest with like how that impacted
not try
everything.
To protect other people's feelings as much as you do. I always describe it as a social grenade. So when you lose your parents a little bit younger and your friends don't anticipate it, you're meeting people mixing usually in a pub, obviously not during COVID. Oh, is that where your parents live, or just something really innocuous like that, and you have to go, oh no, actually my parents have passed away. That person is then kind of paralyzed with this grenade that you've just thrown at them, and then it's up to you to make them feel better and go, oh no, but it's okay and I'm fine, don't worry about it. And so it's this bizarre flip where when people you would think should really be comforting you, you're really comforting them and trying to make sure they're all right. So yeah,
my favorite thing is using the grenade and then not apologizing.
Making
people feel awkward.
Yeah, well, I guess if you meet that type of person who maybe being a little bit brusque, you can say, well, actually this is the case. And
definitely.
So yeah.
You obviously mentioned before we kind of spoken and stuff, I knew that your dad passed away in France, which obviously must have had its own difficulties in itself. I can only imagine how hard that was when you were only 18, but like what was that like the difference in grief from losing your dad so suddenly at 18 to then losing your mum over a longer period of time? Like did you find yourself grieving in very different ways?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously when I lost my dad, that was my first ever major experience of grief of someone extremely close. And when someone dies, in a sudden accident, it's day and night. There is no anticipation of that event. It's, as I look back now, there's a lot more numbness and simply kind of blank spaces in my mind. I think the months following it, I don't really recall anymore. I remember, the main first few days. I remember the funeral, obviously, but the following 4 or 5 months are a real blank for me. And that, that kind of grief is the kind of grief where you wake up in the morning and you're okay for a split second, and then it hits you because you're like, oh my God, this has happened. And and it is truly unbelievable, and it just hits you like a train every morning. I remember in those kind of first weeks after my dad passed away, my mum and I walking the dog together, probably every day. And I think one of the best descriptions I remember coming from myself at that age was saying to my mum, I think it must have been a few weeks later, I feel like we've been tested, and haven't we passed this test now? Like, when's he coming back? Like this, this is, you know, we've done enough. This has been hard enough. Sure, can be expected to keep doing this. And that I was talking about was, how do I keep grieving? How do I keep feeling this bad?
That's such a good representation of actually what it's like, because you are told that, like, you just have this perception of grief, that somebody dies, you grieve for a bit, but it gets easier, but it's such a long game.
It is.
And I bet now, you look back at like that 18-year-old girl, I bet you just want to hug her and be like,
oh yeah.
It's such a weird feeling trying to, like, looking back at that younger version of you that went through something so traumatic. Like, you knew it was bad at the time, but I think even as you get older, you look back at that person and you think, oh my God, that was really, really bad what I went through.
Exactly. And I think, you know, we've, as teenagers, you think you're invincible, you think you're the person on the planet, but you know, you're not, you're 18. And of course, that, when I look back at it, you just go, oh my God, I was just a baby in the world.
Child.
I'd finished school that summer, and it was the October. I was a complete baby.
Yeah.
And then you're given this huge life event that most of your friends, of course, haven't experienced.
Yeah.
You're at that age where you actually see your friends' parents quite a lot. You know, they would be giving you lifts, or they pick you up from the pub. And I would always be really aware of it, thinking, oh, I'm meeting my friends' parents, and they've not even lost their parents. Being really kind and trying to sympathise with me. I remember thinking sometimes I pick up on the fact that their parents were still alive and maybe in their 80s, and just be like quite awed by that concept and be like, you're so lucky, you don't know. And I'm really surprised that I'm experiencing something that this grown-up hasn't experienced, because it doesn't.
It's mad, isn't it? Did you, in those years, like between when you were 18 and when you're kind of in your early 20s, did you like really notice a change in your behaviour compared to everybody else's, like your kind of attitude towards life and your perception towards certain things? Like, I found that I felt I was a lot more mature than the people around me.
Yeah, definitely. I found that for sure. Like when I started university, I had a year out before uni.
Yeah, of course.
And then my first day of university was the first anniversary of my dad's passing away, which was really
You couldn't write it.
No, and that's the kind of, again, total social grenade. People be like, how are you? And you're like, great.
Inside you're just crumbling.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, God.
But yeah, I think you just definitely, you learn, I think you don't sweat the small stuff as much, do you? So I think when people around you are kind of flapping about something that just didn't matter, you find it a bit hard to kind of sympathise, which sounds really fair.
No, it's so true.
Yeah, you know, people complaining about something like, oh, everyone's got their health, you're fine, you know.
Yeah, shut up.
Yeah, you're going to be fine. I would think, yeah, that's definitely the case with that. And also, just going back to the question you asked earlier about difference in grief between dad and my mum.
Yeah.
Obviously, with my mum having cancer, my dad being in an accident, one thing I would reference that I've only really heard described outside of my own head in the last few years is obviously anticipatory grief, when you're aware that someone's very ill. So obviously I had that with my mum, and that was a really, really difficult experience, I would say. Obviously, I remember when I became aware that my mum was unwell, and obviously when you've already lost a parent, you do see your parents as, or the people as actually having a mortality. You know, when you experience that, it doesn't seem that tangible or real. Yeah. But I think when I found out she had cancer, I was like, oh, she really could die. Like, people die.
Yeah.
So that anticipatory grief, I would say, was particularly grueling, and I actually think I found it a lot harder in the lead up to her death. Whereas after she actually passed away, especially in the initial few months, I just went quite numb. I think it was the real fear of it leading up to the event, especially when someone's in front of you and you can hold them and hug them and communicate with them. It's just, I just describe it as a real emotional torture to know someone's that unwell. It's unthinkably hard. So when I think something I'm really interested in is the legalities in time off that people get after being bereaved. Because I think it should be so much higher, and there should be so much more compassion in the workplace, and it should be really enforced, because
it's awful. It's absolutely awful.
It is absolutely awful.
What annoys me is that you get businesses that they say that people's like mental health is really important to them, and they'll give them all the time off that they need. But then what they don't say is, we'll give you all the time off that you need, but we won't pay you for that time off. So then not only are you dealing with the stress of funerals and death and just your life turning upside down, you're not getting paid. And it's like, and then you go into work but you're not performing well, so then you're stressed, you're going to get fired. Like it's such a mess. And I think that just goes to show how grief is not discussed in society at all.
Yeah, it really is. I was really lucky in where I was working. They were exceptionally generous with me, but I was well aware of how lucky I was. And so oh my God, if I worked elsewhere. I spoke to someone for the Grief Kitchen recently, a really lovely girl who lost her fiance when she was about 26, and for the NHS. And I was so shocked that someone who works obviously for the NHS in a position with such care, and also such important work where you really have people's lives in your hands, in at least 2 people's lives in your hands when you're working with a patient. And they are given 1 day off when they're initially bereaved, another day off for the funeral. And if you want any additional time off, you have to be signed off with either depression or anxiety with a proper doctor's note, which is not what grief is. It can lead to those problems, of course. That's not what it is. And she made such an excellent point of saying, I have people's lives in my hands at work, and if I'm not mentally there and connected and fully focused, it's dangerous. And I just was really flabbergasted by that, hearing that the NHS did understand. Yeah, it's really surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely shocking. Talking more about that kind of anticipatory grief aspect of it, I feel like that must have been kind of so much worse for you, because you were also facing the reality that you were going to be in your mid-20s, which is such a pinnacle time in anybody's life, without either of your parents, which having one parent is alien, and not having either of them, I think that must have been such a daunting thing for you to have to face ahead of you. Like, was there anybody else in your immediate circle at all that had lost a parent, or were you kind of completely kind of thrown in to the deep end of having to cope with this by yourself?
I have one or two, less than a handful of lost a parent, at similar ages, and that's always very bonding. But I don't have any friends who've lost both their parents. I'm literally, and I know this to be true, but I'm still like, do I?
Just in case.
Pretty sure I don't. No, I didn't. And you're right, that is exactly, obviously on top of the single focus of not wanting to lose her and being heartbroken at that, it was exactly the additional fear of being, the word orphan is a funny word, especially when you're in your 20s now as an adult, of course. But being without your parents in your mid-20s, and I've got younger siblings, so I was 25 and they were maybe 23 and 22. I think. I felt very responsible for them. I still do.
I bet, like a parent.
Yeah, but obviously they're very concerned about their well-being as well.
Yeah.
And as you all know as well, with death comes a lot of paperwork. And with the death of a second person in a marriage, this is being poorly phrased, but there's obviously inheritance tax and getting out of estates, and a lot of paperwork that you are not in the right frame of mind to be doing, and can't wait.
How did you go about that? Because I personally am very lucky that I haven't had that experience of dealing with the paperwork side of it. My dad was very good after my mum died. He kind of boxed it all off, kept it very internal, didn't really share much of the kind of legalities of it. So, like, did you just rely on Google for help with that? Like, definitely what is there?
Definitely Googled stuff. So my mum was very on it, I'd say, with her will, and she made my godparents trustees of her will. So that and they were always kind of our parents' age, so it was kind of like having substitute parents who we are very close with. They were with us in the room with lawyers often. It was ensured that they understood what was going on as well as us. Going into a meeting and a lawyer's office where people keep referring to the deceased, it just makes your head explode, and you're sat there just not really taking anything in.
I bet.
My godparents there, and they're being a bit more mentally switched on for that. It was, they were being informed as well. And then, it was really just up to my brother and sister and I to, actually, I remember really specifically a few days before Mum passed away, it was obviously very evident at that stage that it was going to be imminent. The three of us sat down together and very emotionally, but it was actually really beautiful. We kind of all just made a promise that we would never be grabby, we would never argue, and we would never be two against one because there's three of us.
Yeah.
And we said, the next few months and however long it ended up being years are going to be really hard, and we're going to have a lot of very adult things to sort through. But let's just remember that we're all on the same side. And if that was stress, it's really natural, and it's also really natural to bicker with your siblings, but not the enemy here. So yeah, we just made an agreement to always be in agreement with each other and never try to strong arm each other into something. And for example, we sold my parents' home, and that's a really big decision to make.
Yeah.
Luckily it was one that we're obviously all on board with. And yeah, we just it was just baby steps and a lot of Googling. Making sure that we are sure about things.
I mean, straight away, that just goes to show how you've literally grown up by about 20 years in the space of a year of your mum passing. All three of you had to just kind of figure out what was important and figure that out. Crazy. Grief is just it's just not known enough how it impacts every part of your life like that, and your actual personality. It's crazy. So by the time obviously you're 25 and you're 30 now, so it's been 5 years. So what is it that you think has kind of helped you the most down your kind of grief journey and now living life without either of your parents over the past 5 years?
That's an interesting question. I think it's helped me the most. Two things come to mind, obviously friendships and food. Mainly cookery, obviously. Obviously you have those particular friends when you're grieving that you really do feel that you can just completely open up to, and without those friends, oh God, I don't know where I'd be. So I'm very lucky to have some very strong friendships, and I do sometimes feel for those friends because obviously they've been through it with me twice. So obviously friends is an obvious answer, but for me personally, we were always a really foodie family, and after my dad passed away, I went to university. I studied art history, and I worked in the art world for a few years. And I was still working there when my mum was unwell. And I found that when I was grieving, and once I'd gone back to work, I was just so disconnected from my work. That's one key thing that I think grief really shook up in me, was an inability to connect with things that I just didn't find important.
Yeah, get that.
And but to a point at which I'd be at work and I wasn't performing well enough. I wouldn't employ me now thinking that, it was a shame because I just couldn't mentally connect with them. It was great. When you're typing away and you've got a vision in your head of, your unwell parent and it's going to always a flashback. You can't be at work. It doesn't work.
100%.
So I ended up finding that I was taking a lot of solace in cooking, and that would be my kind of way of switching off and relaxing. I found that if I was happy, my brain would still be going and I'd be distracted and I wouldn't really be watching it. But there's something very mindful about physically getting a recipe book, reading a recipe and following a step, that real using your hands, physical actions of, okay.
It's creative. It's a creative outlet. And I think a lot of people do go down that creative route when somebody's died. I think you see it from podcasts, art, writing, cooking, all of these things are such a huge help. And I think it was so interesting to kind of figure out, to learn more about why that is, why we find so much solace in these things.
Definitely. Well, it forces you to be very present, I think, because with what you're doing, you can't, I find personally, I'm not dwelling on the past or the future, which is where tend to lie. So after realizing how much I was enjoying that's what led me to go to cookery school at the age of 29, which is,
I love that.
That was in 2019, and the grief kitchen has kind of been born out of that, and it's been a really natural progression, which has been really, it's just lovely, as obviously you found with your podcast, to find that real kind of root purpose that is find. So it's so worthwhile and it's so helpful to people.
Well, you said something really interesting earlier about the connection between the mind and then being ill, which I'm such a huge believer in. But I'm also a huge believer in food affecting your mind. Like, I think it's all so connected.
Yeah.
And I think like taking the time to cook real food for ourselves and nourishing yourself with not just like healthy food, but food that you find real enjoyment in, I think that is so good for your mind, which in turn is good for your body and your overall health. And I do think it's really interesting, you know, just with the development of the Grief Kitchen. I remember because I started following you ages ago, and it was the first thing that I thought about was like, there really is such a huge connection between grief and food, and sometimes that can be an unhealthy connection where we use food as our crutch. I can be quite bad for binge eating when I'm stressed or not having a good time. But I do think there's a beautiful aspect to it as well. So like, I'd love to find out more about the Grief Kitchen kind of from you, and what that means to you and how you kind of envision it.
So, I mean, there's different parts to it, and one huge part of it is that the idea of recipe sharing. I mean, the reason that I initially connected food and grief was when I found myself cooking recipes that I really associated with my parents. My dad always made this particular mushroom risotto, and I find myself recreating it, or my mum's chicken soup, that sort of thing. And I thought, wouldn't it be so cool if people submitted recipes and other people, you know, in this community took them and cooked them and said, you know, it could connect, you know, someone in Canada could connect with someone in France saying, oh, I made your dad's pecan pie and it was delicious.
I love that.
And we know that it's John's pecan pie. You know, I just thought that's to keep things alive. I love having recommended recipes from other people and trying new things. And I love hearing nostalgic stories behind those recipes. It strikes a chord with me. And I know that we all have them. It's an obvious, it's such an easy kind of icebreaker into people's grief, I think, especially when people who've not experienced grief themselves, you know, they're normally very afraid to bring it up with you. I think it goes to show that, you know, it's quite an easy icebreaker into talking about someone that's gone with someone who's grieving. So that's one key aspect, is the recipe sharing, but also just kind of making people aware of cookery as a mindful activity, just as something to do when you really are not feeling up to doing much else. I've definitely been there with grief where, you know, you're not leaving the house, COVID or no COVID, I wasn't leaving the house. At least call it COVID, but you know, the days where you kind of really can't be bothered to have a shower, you can't feel what's the point in anything. On those days, I do remember going, okay, I'm gonna just put on some clean pajamas and I'm gonna make this like loaf cake. It's science, but I'm just gonna stand in the kitchen and do it. And I feel so much better for doing it. And I just think that's quite a universal thing.
100%. I've actually found myself really leaning into that in lockdown. Is like, I have this like craving every week to just make something. Like, I think because we have no control over anything that's happening right now, and it's the same with grief. Like, you feel like you're losing control, and I think, like you were saying, it's just the ability to just use our hands to create something that is so nice to enjoy afterwards as well. Like, I make these cinnamon rolls, and I am obsessed with them. Like, absolutely obsessed. I can't think of anything better any time of day. They're my favorite.
It's so important to actually treat yourself as well, like especially in lockdown, you know, when you know you can't go out, you can't treat yourself to something. So many people talk about foods that they like immediately with guilt, and I just think, God, why? Like, enjoy it, you know. It sounds like I'm being melodramatic or trying to come back to the point too much here, but genuinely, life is short. Eat 3 cinnamon rolls if you really want to. You're not going to do it every day.
Don't you start me twice.
When you're baking something, I mean, baking is like dangerous because I'm living with one other person at the moment, and so when bake, it's like, well, we're both going to eat half a cake.
So true. That is the issue, isn't it?
It's not the worst thing in the world. Obviously, I'm not saying that you should binge eat cake all day.
No, I do think what you're doing is such a beautiful concept, and you know, on this grief community, which we're so lucky to have, it's not something that I've seen anybody else doing. So I think so many people are going to find kind of value and comfort in kind of making those connections that you probably wouldn't have made before, with things that you enjoy eating. Or like, I've got this thing for on my mum's funeral, my brother made this chocolate Guinness cake, and it was amazing. And gutted my mum never got to taste it because she was a chocolate fiend. Well, that's where I get it from, like obsessed. But now for some reason every year on her anniversary I make this chocolate Guinness cake, that death anniversary.
Oh, that's nice.
And even though it was something that we actually had on her funeral, it's something that I really relate to her. And God, I love it. It's amazing.
Okay, I want that recipe as well, please, because that sounds great.
I'll share it. It is delicious. But yeah, I think I'm really kind of excited to see where that could go, because I can imagine you doing like grief retreats that are like cooking based. And I think
definitely that was the original idea was I wanted to do cookery classes. So they definitely will happen already. But that was my initial thought, is wouldn't it be great if you could do a grief-based cookery classes for people to socialise? And if that was really born out of me, I was living in London, young professional in my 20s working away, and I just didn't have any like-minded friends who'd been in that situation. And I used to think, how do I meet them? You need an icebreaker. You can't just say, oh, we're going to meet in the park and just talk about death. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't personally have signed up for it, I don't think. So I think having that icebreaker of like, everyone come along, we're all going to have a cocktail and we're going to make pancakes. It works.
My friend actually participated in like a kind of, it was like an art study when she was at uni for her friend, and her friend was asking people, she was filming them, and she was asking them to knead this big ball of dough. And as they were doing it, she was asking them questions. And it was kind of like to show that when people are doing something with their hands and making something, they become so much more like relaxed and open, and they share when they're doing it. And I think like what you're doing will literally be that, like when you're kind of in the kitchen cooking around, it is so much easier to talk to people, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it'd be perfect.
Kind of that initial distraction, and you're just a bit less self-conscious, aren't you?
Yeah.
And also putting everyone in the same boat and saying, look, we're all beginners, no one's, I don't know, made dim sum before, let's all learn some. Then it's, you're in the same boat. And I would really love to do specific classes where people can join who are maybe, in their 20s to 30s who've lost a parent and they don't have friends, or maybe someone who's lost someone to suicide, or specifically someone who's lost a friend who's the same age as them, which is complete, I can't even imagine. There's specific different like pockets of grief. I would love to facilitate those meetings.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to see. I can't wait to come.
I can't wait to host
I'd love it.
Freedom to meet people and make it happen. That'd be great.
Yeah, and I can't think of anywhere better to do something like that in the Cotswolds either.
God, yeah,
amazing.
Really nice.
Okay, so one of my favorite questions to ask people, because it always has a positive spin on it, which is amazing when you've been through something so awful. But what would you say, or would you say that it's changed the way that you now go about life and the way that you approach and see life?
Yeah, definitely. It's I think it's definitely given me a real sense of, I just don't feel apologetic about wanting to enjoy my life. Do you know what I mean? When you hear people do this, same thing with guilt around food or guilt around taking holiday days off work, and people say, oh, I shouldn't. I'm like, well, I would not be looking back once. I just think, definitely a real sense of making the most of your life. It's so short. Like I said earlier, my dad was 48. There's no age at all. And both he and my mum, but my dad was quite an out there character. He was life and soul of the party. And I think he really, passed it on to me and my siblings. And I just always remember him just taking a real joy in, daily occurrences, whether it was just us all getting outside for a walk together, or at the weekends, him and my mum opening a bottle of champagne or a bottle of wine. It was the real appreciation of it, and just noticing the appreciation of it. Whenever we were all on holiday together, he would really make a point of going, this is really special, that we really like this. And he had this saying where he would say, I always knew, when he said it, I knew he was really happy, and it really like transferred onto me. I always remember him saying it once, we're at the top of a ski slope about skis together, and he said, oh, it really doesn't get better than this.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and I love that. And it just made me think, right, okay, the purpose of life is to have as many moments possible where you feel that truly in your heart.
Yeah.
So I just don't feel guilty about wanting to enjoy my life. I really don't.
Yeah.
It's a gift. And I think, after my mum being unwell, I feel very conscious of the fact that our health and our youth is a gift. And not to be taken for granted. And it's, youth is wasted on the young, makes me sound really old, but
you're definitely not old. It's interesting that you say that, because that's something that I think I've been really struggling with lockdown, because you have that perception of life is so short. I really want to enjoy as much as I can. I want to have the opportunity to live my life. The fact that we're unable to do that makes me a lot more wary of the fact that I'm not being able to enjoy it, and I do think that's something that probably grievers are more aware of than non-grievers, because other people think that they're immortal, whereas you're very much aware that you're definitely. I've got some really weird thing where I think I'm going to die before I'm 30. I think that's just death anxiety.
Death anxiety is the real thing, really real.
Yeah.
And I definitely, you mentioning that has just made me realise, like, I think my death anxiety has got a bit better, actually, because I go me. I've definitely been in the grips of that much more in the past, and it's understandable, isn't it?
Yeah, it's strange, because I don't sit and get kind of anxious about it, but I do, when I'm out and about, I picture things happening that could kill me, which is so. I don't think it's like, it's not so unhealthy in a way, even though it's not healthy, but like I don't let it consume me. But I think it's just something that I'm very mindful of. I'm like, that's so weird that I do that, because I bet other people don't do that.
I do that as well, for sure. Like if a bus goes past you too quick, you're like, I could have just been killed.
Like a minute.
And actually, that you're reminding me of, I think quite soon after my mum died, within the first year, I had a bad cough. I mean, I wasn't even a bad cough, I had a cough. And I went to the doctor in London, and I remember just like breaking down in tears saying, I think I've got cancer. I'd convinced lung cancer. My mum didn't have lung cancer, it was separate. But I'd convinced myself I had lung cancer. And, obviously he ascertained it was just a cough, and it was a few weeks and I was fine. That was death anxiety.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember a few weeks, the next time I went to the doctors, this is probably not what I meant to do, doctor leaving the room briefly, and your notes are on their computer screen.
Do you look?
I look.
Did he say very anxious about dying?
Up, and I was just like, I wonder what's going on here. And I could see the notes from that last visit where and he had written up something like, patient was, I don't know if the word was hysterical, or it was a little bit, I took it badly. I was like, I wasn't hysterical, I wasn't unreasonable. It's death anxiety.
It was legitimate.
Yeah, it was legitimate. But then I saw myself through his eyes, and I was like, oh gosh, did I seem not okay? Which probably wasn't okay, to be honest. But that's death anxiety.
Yeah, it's such a thing, and I do hope that it's something that you kind of grow out of as you get older, kind of in a weird way. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
I guess my last question is, what advice would you give to somebody who has recently lost a parent?
Recently lost a parent I would say, it sounds so cliched, but I just say be so gentle and kind to yourself. And it's so hard to measure time, but I think when it's recent, every week that goes by can feel quite long, and you start to think, it's been a month now, so I should be fine, or I should be performing really well at work. No, you shouldn't. It would be quite strange if you were. And if you are, that's probably because you're numb. And I had that as well, where I was all about socializing and stuff after my mum passed away, because I was very conscious of not wanting people to see me as this kind of grim reaper and depressing person. So I was like, I'm going to be fine, and I'm going to impress everyone with how fine I am. Yeah. And now I look back and I'm like, oh God, I was at this like Tasmanian devil of like chaotic, hectic energy. And I just needed to be really gentle and kind with myself. And I think the best advice I've heard before, and it's actually more to do just with self-care, whether you've been bereaved or not, is to just treat yourself like a small child.
Yeah.
Make sure you're getting enough sleep, and make sure you're getting well fed, and nourish yourself. And if you want to sleep a bit later, have a lie-in, and don't punish yourself for it. It's just really gentle, basic
listening to your body.
Yeah, just completely. And I think that advice is really not very good, because it's really hard to take.
No, it's perfect. Sometimes people need that reminder as well, and I do have a lot of listeners that are recently bereaved. I do think just being reminded sometimes that, one, it's normal if you're not okay.
Yeah.
no matter how far away, how far down the line you are, and to listen to yourself and to know when to just take it slow and take a breath.
Yeah, because I'm here talking about my dad still, and I was 18, I'm 31 now, and that's not meant to sound like some doomsday thing for people who've been bereaved. It gets a lot better, and I've come a long way. It's 12 years, and I remember him so happily now, and when I think about him, it's always positive, and I think about him every day, and I see things from him in myself and in my siblings every day that make me really happy.
I love that.
But grief is always there, of course. There's always really bittersweet moments, especially when you're bereaved a bit younger. You have those significant life milestones to come that a lot of people do have their parents there for, which is hard. That is hard. Weddings are hard.
Oh, don't. I've actually, on that note, in my friendship group, one of my best friends is the first person now to become pregnant.
Oh, yeah.
And she was sharing like videos of her telling her mum and her telling her grandparents and stuff. And I don't have any of my grandparents now, and obviously I don't have my mum. And I was just like, I'm so unbelievably happy for her. I'm so pleased for her, but I'm so unbelievably jealous. Like, and it's just it's just a fact of life when you're grieving, isn't it? Like, you can't brush that jealousy aside. And obviously you must have experienced it yourself. Like, your mum passing away when you're 25, like 25 to like 35 is just like wedding season. Baby
and that's
season.
the age when you want, that's the age when you're quite likely to be dating and in a relationship. Advice from your parents about those.
And you become friends with your parents at that age as well, right? Like, it's not so much parent-daughter relationship, but you actually build a friendship. And I think it's completely normal that we feel like we've been kind of robbed of a best friend that we won't get.
100%. And on the subject of friends having babies, I noticed something quite interesting when one of my very best friends is due to give birth any day now, and with her family, which is very exciting. And she has obviously a lot of good friends, one of them being me and one of them being another girl who also lost her mum to cancer.
Oh, wow.
And what she noticed was, I was there with her when she told her wider group of friends, she told us all at a big lunch. And obviously she told me individually before. When she told me, I couldn't help but cry.
I cried.
But it was so significant to me, because what really hit me was, oh my God, you're going to have a relationship with your child like I had with my mum. That sounds really weird about myself, but like a mother-child relationship is so special. And it seemed like such complete magic to me that she was going to have that.
Yeah.
And when I was there, when she told the wider group of friends, including this other girl who'd also been bereaved, I noted that she was the only other person who cried. And the friend noticed that. She said, I tell all my friends everyone's really happy, but it's my two friends who've lost their mums who both like cried for me with happiness when I told them.
Yeah, so true. Because you really have such an appreciation for that bond, don't you? Like, I am really like, I want to have children, and I am looking forward to having that bond with my children.
Yeah.
Even if it's just to, in a way, it's to replace the bond that I've not got right now. Like, and I can admit to that, but also it's just because I'm so excited to feel that same level of love and to know how my mum felt when she had me. I can't wait to just know what that feels like, and to know, I think it's like knowing that you were loved. Like, I know that I was loved, but I want to know how much.
That's really true. That's really true. Yeah, and it's going to be a lovely thing to experience. I think it's everyone says you can't imagine it until you experience.
Yeah.
And when you do, you'll go, oh my God, she loved me so much.
Yeah.
I already know that, but to actually feel it will be really, really.
Like an incredible moment. Well, thank you so much for your time. I've loved this conversation. It's been really lovely.
Me too. It's been an absolute pleasure. My favourite type of conversation.
It's grief, death, and food.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Well, before we go, can you just let everybody know where they can find you on Instagram so they can follow all of your kind of amazing ideas and future plans and stuff?
Yes, it's just at The Grief Kitchen, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and all my contact details on there. You can and follow. That'd be lovely.
Perfect. Nice and simple. Fab. Well, make sure you do give Alex a follow, and thank you everybody for listening, and thank you, Alex, for your time again. I appreciate it.
Thank you.